Ready to go live? The door's shut, so I can't tell. Well, good morning, everybody. My name's Mike Browning. I'm the Emergency Services Coordinator for Mojave County, and I'd like to welcome everybody to our Colorado River Earthquake Risk presentation. The Arizona Geological Survey, part of U of A, has put a presentation together for us this morning to share with you. Before we get started, I would like to ask everybody if you have questions as we go through the presentation. We'll break through the conversation and ask if there's questions, so if you could hold those, and then we'll bring that point up, and then you can, through the chat line, if you're online watching this, we'll give you an opportunity to ask questions. So real quick, safety items. If the fire alarm system goes off, we're just going to go ahead and exit through the exit here out to the front parking lot. There's a set of public restrooms back into the hallway here in the lobby and to your left if that is needed. We'll have to have IT checked in. And maybe they couldn't hear us that we got started too. Test 1, 2, 3. Got it. Good to go. So I'll go ahead and repeat the portion about the questions. I think we had a dead mic. So during the presentation, if you have some questions that come up, please hold them. We'll have an opportunity to answer questions as we go through the subject matter. And that'll be accomplished on the chat option on Teams. I think we finished. If there's any need to leave the building because of safety reasons, just leave the doors here, go out the front exit, and we'll meet out in the front parking lot. With that, I'd like to introduce Jerry with U of A, Arizona Geological Survey, and let her get going. Thank you much.
Can we get the slides on the monitor? There we go. Good morning. My name is Jerry. Thanks for having me. This talk will actually be in kind of 3 mini pieces. So the title of the talk is just to bring awareness about earthquakes to Mojave County with a focus on 2 active faults. One's called the Mead Slope Fault and the Needles Fault. So this is just a little roadmap to tell you about how we're going to get through this talk. I'll give you a little bit about my background, and then a small overview of Arizona's seismic hazards, which includes where does seismicity occur and faults. Where are they located? Different types of faults exist, and Arizona has one dominant type, which I'll explain. And then I'll talk about the Needles Fault in particular, and some HAZIS modeling. So some people may not know what HAZIS is, and I'll explain that as well. And then most of the data that is in this HAZIS, just remember, came from 2000. So I'll explain that in just a bit. And we can also discuss, after you know what HAZIS is and the Needles HAZIS modeling, I'll discuss the shortcomings with you. So this talk actually came about because the Wallapai tribe and the Fort Mojave tribe wanted me to give a talk on their specific faults that they have in their regions. And that kind of grew with Mike's help to making this a broader talk to bring more people in and make them more aware of the hazards that are within the county. 2 big hazard faults. One's Needles and one is Mead Slope. My background, I hail from Southern California, and I got my first degree at Cal State Fullerton, and I came to ASU for my doctorate with Ramon Aerosmith and Steve Reynolds as my advisors. And then I stayed, and I live here, and before working for the Arizona Geological Survey, which is what I do now. I worked for a couple engineering companies, and I also taught at Scottsdale Community and ASU for a little bit. I've been with the survey at least 15 years. I have a wide range in duties, some of which include field mapping, where I get to go outside and get away from the desk. And then the other bit of duties is to take care of the seismic network. So we actually have machines that monitor earthquakes in Arizona, and I'm your go-to, just me. So hopefully I won't bore you with this, but I'm going to explain a little bit about seismic hazard in Arizona. A lot of people come from California. They say, oh, we don't have hazards. That's a California problem. But what we have here, is there a pointer on this, on the top? Let's see. Or anyway, just at the top of the map here, you can see we have all these dots. The legend on the bottom shows earthquakes that we've recorded since we've had instruments in the ground that can pick up earthquakes, and then sometimes if the earthquakes were large enough, they get recorded in newspapers even in the 1800s. So we've compiled what we know about where these earthquakes occurred and the sizes of those. So I just want to say, if you looked at this, you would say, oh yeah, there's plenty of earthquakes. This is a tiny snapshot of what really has occurred and is occurring in our state, given that we don't have enough ears on the ground, so to speak, to get them all. This is just what we're able to pick up in the last 10 years, plus some of those historic quakes. So you might see some of these blue circles, the bright blue, those are mag 5s to 5.9s. We have several that are overshadowed by Flagstaff. They're dark blue, that's kind of underneath all the smaller dots. Those are 6s. And then over closer to Hoover Dam, off to that little mitten of Arizona along the Colorado River, there were larger quakes there just within that Nevada, California, Arizona area, and then some larger ones in other parts. So we know we have the earthquakes, and we know that compared to California, yes, they're less frequent, but they do occur. So how, like I mentioned, how we monitor them is we have all these little dots and the triangles and all the little symbols on here represent locations of where we've got these seismometers. And look, by Wallapai Mountain, there's actually one monitoring earthquakes right now. All of these stations monitor quakes 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, with data piping into the server in Tucson, and that we crunch and turn into what you might call seismograms and look for earthquakes. And all of that also gets used by your federal government to look for regional quakes and say even bomb blasts in Korea. So these are very sensitive instruments. They can pick up a squirrel running across the ground by it or a bomb blast in Russia. So they're very sensitive, and they do require some babysitting. And since we've had them, we've had a 10 to 20-fold increase in the amount of earthquakes we add to the little list or catalog. So they've been very useful, and so that's part of our seismic kind of taking care of the state program. The other thing is that we go out and map quaternary, or what we call active earthquake faults. And in this map here, you're just seeing these kind of color-coded lines on the map. If you look at this map and you go back to this map, you might notice that in the northern part of the state, you have a lot of seismicity, right, compared to the rest. And if you look at this map of the faults, these are active faults. Most of the faults occur in the northern part of the state, with some exceptions. And so what we like to do is to go out and define their length and define what we think might tell us something about their activity. Okay, so just a little primer on earthquake fault types. There are generally 3 types, and this cute little block diagram, the upper left is showing a fault type where the ground comes together and squishes the crust, and it makes a thrusting or pushing together from compressional forces. On the upper left is one called a normal fault, and that's where the ground is extending or pulling away like taffy, where you're getting a downdropping of the ground. And so these are important things to know, because that tells you something about the directivity or the way the waves from an earthquake are going to move. And this last one is cute. It's one of my favorite ones, and we don't have a whole lot of these in Arizona, but it's called a strike-slip fault. And people may know that the San Andreas system is one of these types of faults. So in Arizona, we have the normal fault, the pulling apart extensional forces kind of thing, where the taffy's pulling apart and we're down dropping the ground. And if you look in this figure where those little purple or magenta arrows are, you see the fault plane under the ground actually has like a geometry to it. Is it vertical? Is it somewhat flat? These are things that we learn as we go out in the field and map faults. We want to know that geometry because we want to know what that energy might look like during a rupture of the ground. So now into like real, where the rubber meets the road and how we might discuss an earthquake, a normal fault in Arizona. The Needles Fault is one of those down-dropping kind of faults. It has multiple little strands, as you see from this image here, those little red lines, and it's on this east side of the Colorado River, not far from the 40, which is just a little faint kind of line on the bottom, just above the scale that I'm showing you there. So when we think of California, they always have earthquakes. They've got all these faults and big mountains. But when we think of Arizona, what we need to kind of imprint in our mind is that, yes, we don't have as frequent events, but we do have earthquakes that can be large enough to cause significant damage. And we call them low slip rates, where they kind of hang out and just, they don't move very much, but sometimes they move in a big way. Okay, so they are active, but with a low slip rate. And so this Needles Fault, for years, people thought it was this just cute little short fault that, it looked like, how could it have, ruptured the ground when we see these boulders are offset, or these different alluvial fans, if you know what those are, but it's so short. And so with better imagery over the years, we have found that this fault is at least 18 kilometers. And so why does that matter? You might look at that little equation there and ignore it for a bit. I'll just explain that when you think about the energy of the earth being released in an earthquake, the amount of energy it takes to move the ground or rupture the surface is correlative to the size of the event. So in other words, if the ground is only ruptured, a segment of the ground is only 4 kilometers ruptured, that means the earthquake might have been very small. If the rupture is capable of 18 kilometers, you might be looking at something like a magnitude 6.7, which is a lot more energy released. So that's a little bit whitewashing what this equation means, but the reason why we care so much about mapping these faults is because the length, the geometry, and what kind of landforms it cuts, old, young, intermediate, is very important. So what we did in 2012, unrelated to just discussing the Needles Fault, we just happened to have these model runs by the Arizona Geological Survey, myself and a student, where we looked at faults throughout Arizona and said, let's pick some important ones. And we picked Needles, Lake Mary, the Hurricane Fault, and several others. And we used this FEMA software, in which I'm going to explain what that is in just a second here, I think in the next slide. So is anybody in the room familiar with HAZUS besides me, the nightmare? Okay, a couple people. So it is free, and you kind of get what you pay for sometimes, with respect to getting the software running, but it was developed by FEMA, and people scoff at FEMA all the time, but this is a really powerful piece of software in that you can estimate risk from hazards such as earthquakes and floods, given all the data that comes with the software. And so it's very powerful. It can give you an estimate of damage and casualties, and even specifics like damage to what kind of buildings, steel, unreinforced masonry, etc. So this little plot on the bottom, this table, is just, I threw that in there because I wanted to remind people that the HAZUS modeling, the most important feature of it means it relies on the geology, so that thing about the faults, the length, the dip, and all that, you put that in the model, and also the inventory. So what they did was, because they made this program for the whole U.S., they had to take every state and every county in the United States and give the model some information about infrastructure, number of hospitals, what types of buildings, how many people. So when we ran the model, it says 2010, but I just looked at the population in the model. At the bottom here, it was 155,000 for Mojave County. That's actually from the year 2000. So either the population in the model is just 2000 and the infrastructure is 2010. It's something I have to look into for you. But nonetheless, I'm going to stop right now. For anybody in the room that has a question about what this modeling is, I can answer that. And if you have questions in the chat and you're a fast typer. Okay? So I'll explain it. It's going to be a little more explanatory as I move on. Let's see. Well, okay. So what happens is in this GIS-based software, you give it the geology and the rupture of the earthquake and where it occurs at depth, and then under the hood it has a shake map and it has information about your county's infrastructure. And in the end, it comes up with possible damage based on that earthquake that you give it. And so this is just one of many, many tables. I'm going to show you just a few of the important tables that came out of that model run in 2012. So, and this is kind of what they look like. They'll show buildings, no damage, slight damage, moderate damage, extensive and complete, and that's at the top. And then if you scroll down those columns, you'll see what the percentage or even the total number of damage to those buildings might be. And so this is the kind of information that comes out. And you say, well, what can I do with that? What buildings are they? And so there are things that people have done with HAZUS to get really specific, and we didn't go that far. We just wanted to see, would you have damage? And in this case, when we did the model run, yes, you would have complete damage of some structures and mostly residential. So you can also break that down, as like I said, into different types: wood, steel, concrete, precast. It even discusses, are there damage to police departments, fire departments, hospitals? How many hospital beds do you have, and how many would you need based on the number of projected casualties? It has all this information in it. It's kind of powerful, a little bit limited. And here's the one that's kind of, I sometimes don't like to show this kind of morbid result that comes out of the model, but this is casualty estimates based on severity. So they call severity 1, you'll have injuries and you need some medical attention. Severity 2, you have injuries, but they're not life-threatening, but you have to go to the hospital. 3, you have severe injury, you might end up expiring later. And number 4, you already have expired immediately after the earthquake. Sorry, the table's a little small. But you see on this table where it has the 2 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and 5 o'clock in the late afternoon on the very far left. And then you can scroll across and see the level of casualties. And so you have some people with injury, 500 to 349, and then you have deaths from 32 to maybe 26 people. And remember, that's from how many people were in the model. Only 155,000 people in Mojave County. How many do you have today? Does anybody know? Isn't it like 217 or 213,000? So this shows you that it's a little outdated, but even one, we don't want even one person having an injury if we can help it. So I don't want to bore you with too many of the tables, but there are so many cool ones. This one shows at the bottom, shows the different pipelines and number of breaks. And this is based on old infrastructure data. So you will have at least 2 gas lines damaged and maybe more than 7 electrical lines damaged. And possibly potable water, wastewater, and gas line breaks will occur. The thing I thought, it also gives this information about hospital beds. They say 200 beds available on the day of the earthquake. Well, we already saw we had hundreds of injuries. And these were pre-COVID estimates, so I don't know what that might look like now. No damage to essential buildings, because they're built to withstand much larger ground shaking or earthquakes associated with those. I like this slide because it shows what happens to the ground during an earthquake is that you can measure the acceleration of the ground. And so in this image, you kind of see this almost target-looking color, but what the problem with the model is that it stops at the county boundaries. So, of course, the shaking's not going to stop right at the Colorado River. But this is kind of what we get out of that model. For Arizona, here are your counties, and that's how it works. So it'd be nice to kind of stitch the three areas together if we could, the other sides. So in this picture, though, all I'm showing is you see the faults in that kind of bright red, the Needles fault. And you've got your I-40 there. And then you see the different rings. So that total ellipse would be about 100 kilometers long. And so the severe shaking is the red. So that's at least, the red and purple is almost half of that 100 kilometers. You're going to have severe shaking. And one thing I want to make sure people know is this model is the biggest earthquake we think might happen on that fault, but also excludes the ground liquefaction of sand material. And so that can cause other problems with structures. That's not modeled in this particular model. So that goes back onto this last slide, which is what are has the shortcomings? And you can't model for specific communities. It was based on county, and you saw the odd boundary zone problems that the model has. It relies on just the shaking estimate that they use for the whole state. And we know that if you shake some areas with the same amount of starting energy, it's going to shake some areas more than others. So those are site-specific conditions that are unique. And when you have sandy material and you shake it with an earthquake, many people know what liquefaction is, but it's just this absorption of the energy through those porous grains and that cause collapse of a lot of structures. So what we like to do, I know this was a lot about this HAZUS modeling, but what goes into a lot of this is knowing the history of that fault and what it really looks like. And so, meaning how long is it? What's the geometry? How old is the last rupture? Do we have any of this information? And we don't have that information to date. It's something we've been working on, trying to get some federal funding for quite a while through a program called NEHRP. And that's the National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program. And that's through the United States Geological Survey. So that's a very competitive program, and you have to show need. So when a community says, hey, can you give a talk on the Needles fault and tell us about it, that is enough of interest that we would go and try to apply for this funding to learn more about this earthquake fault in your area. One of the ways we do that is with LiDAR mapping. Does anybody know what that is? Where it's really high resolution surface model, and that can show you the tiniest little breaks that you can't see on the ground when you're outside walking around. And I'll show you a great example of what we did for Meade Slope, because we had the same problem with this other fault that's by Hoover Dam. And I also mentioned just learning more about the histories and the geometry. That's something we call a paleoseismic study, where we dig across it and it looks like a archaeological kind of survey of the sediment and the ruptures. And so we can learn something about the earthquake history. So I could open it up for any questions. We could scroll back to images if needed. Question? Okay, in that one image of I call it the lopsided target. Let's see. So if you look down at this little legend I threw in there, sorry I didn't explain that as clearly, but this is called peak ground acceleration, and it's derived from that HAZUS modeling. And in the red, you have really high peak ground acceleration of about 0.3, where the ground's moving. That's 0.3% of gravity. And then same with moving out into the purple would be about 0.2, and then in the green, you're looking at 0.08 peak ground acceleration. So it gives you an idea about how quick the ground would move within so many seconds. This was a 3-second window. And so it has this at the end, gives you a bunch of these maps that look like that one in the upper right, which you're like, there's nothing, other than the county shape. So I took that and stretched it over this Google Earth image to kind of show you where that exactly would be. And so if you ran different size earthquakes, you would get different numbers. But remember, this is just an estimate because we don't know what the geometry of the fault is, meaning how shallow that geometry is, the true length, and some other parameters that go into making this. So this is just a best guess. But I think HAZUS is pretty powerful when you have everything you need and at least gives you some stab in the dark. Does that make sense?
So you're saying if you're in the green zone,
Oh, yeah. You would know, and it would even be outside of this. So this is just its estimate for that area based on the shake model. So you would feel a 6, 7 quite a ways away. And sometimes if you're in an area with like hard rock and not as much sediment, those seismic waves can travel through that better, and you can feel it further away. So it just depends on, again, where you live. Does seismic energy cross the fault or a big valley that absorbs that energy? So you've all been in a swimming pool, and if somebody takes a big wakeboard and they splash the wave towards you, you're going to have that frontal bit of the wave like splash on you. If you turn to the side and that same energy came at you, it'd be much less. So that's something called directivity. When an earthquake happens, it sends that energy in some direction. So that's why the geometry is so important, to know which direction it's going to go. And we can also model that in this HAZUS program if needed. But any other questions? Plenty of time. So I think I went over these shortcomings. And discussion, I just wanted to make sure that we didn't have any questions, and that you guys kind of understood there's mapping, and there's studying earthquake faults, there's monitoring the seismicity with those machines, and then you can also use HAZUS to actually estimate the risk that your communities may experience from an earthquake on a given fault that you supply to that model. We can improve the model by what I was saying before: give it soils maps so we know about liquefaction, improve the inventory. So this inventory, I asked FEMA, I said, well, where'd you get all this information about the unreinforced masonry, like the pipelines? And they have such turnover that when they started the program to now, they're like, we don't know. So some of it's slightly accurate, but we would definitely want to update that inventory. So you would have to go to counties and cities and figure out, where the infrastructure lie, and new infrastructure and more people, et cetera. So you'd improve this inventory, I think, is super important. And then who's going to do that? And also wanted to mention to tribal communities that they can put earthquakes in their hazard profile. So when there are earthquakes that damage a county, they usually are aware of this, and then if they have it in their profile, they get extra FEMA funding if something's damaged. And so just outreach and talking to you guys is super important to get that point across for counties and tribes. Any other questions? So I took this picture. I was actually chased by these horses up by Fredonia. I was out mapping up there, and I'd seen, cattle all day, and heifers and babies, and a bull, and he didn't look happy, but he was fine. And then late in the day, I'm out there, and I see these horses off in the distance. I'm like, huh, and here they came. They got real close and were actually acting like, I was in their territory, but that's where this picture's from way up there north of Grand Canyon. Okay. Well, and it does depend on how old the structure is, what's the integrity of that. And so we're going to talk about the Mead Slope Fault, which is only, as the crow flies, about its tip end to Hoover, 5 kilometers. And so, yes, if we had a 6-7 on Needles, what would that do exactly? Well, we just plan that, yes, we will have damage. That's the thing that came out of HAZUS, is you will have it. Where exactly, sometimes you might know better than the model, because you're like, I know this bridge is old, and the concrete's degrading, or, people might have better ideas and input and can collaborate on that. I just ran this model blankly to get a statewide understanding of, what this hazard might be for this community and several others. Right, and that's why I was here. And also, just even I-40, what if part of that's closed? How are we going to get?
I-40 between Needles and Kingman, you know, there's been a lot of people that have wondered why the road's always bumpy right there.
Yeah.
This explains it. And they fix it, 2 months later, it's bumpy again. So we know that there's constant activity there. It may not be something we can fill, but if we get something like a 6.7, yeah, we're going to know about it. We're going to have some.
Yeah, it's just a matter of, the when, so that we get comfortable because we don't feel them every day. And we have a lot of other problems. We've got COVID and fires or floods and drought, and so it gets put on the back burner. But if you're aware and you're prepared, when it happens, it's not as damaging. That's kind of our job, right? Mike, you're going to say something? Come use this one.
Let Byron try to secure this mic so we don't get feedback.
Yeah. It looks like I only put one person to sleep.
So what was the comment? We talked about infrastructure along Interstate 40 near the Needles Fold. Yeah, so one of our goals this morning is really to introduce you to this fault line, and we've invited a lot of utility companies, everything from the pipelines to power, anybody that's got a vested interest in TOPOC, because when were those bridges built? Under what kind of design? A lot of that infrastructure was done years and years and years ago before models like this or information regarding the size of the fault. So as we move forward, if there's development, hazardous material storage, Interstate 40, rail, all the things that we're very concerned about from public safety runs right through that environment. And it's important that everybody that has a piece of real estate down there are responsible for public safety, that we all become more aware of that concern and do more outreach to the public as well as our utility partners out there along the river, so that if we ever do feel an event from a fault like this, that our response plans, our contingency plans, what we do after that shaking starts. Maybe it's the railroad shutting railroad traffic down before they cross the Colorado River. Maybe it's a pipeline that has procedures to secure or check lines, those kinds of things. So we'll move forward with this as we go through the presentation a little more, but I think with the Needles Fold, there's things there that we really historically haven't had an opportunity to talk about as a community, and this will be our first opportunity to get that information to you. Yes, we invited some 50-some agencies, law enforcement, fire, everybody that we could look at that was close to that environment or right through that environment. And this presentation is also being recorded on YouTube, so we can take that and share it with many others when we finish here today that may have not been able to participate or watch it this morning.
The other thing I think is important, I'm talking about models and whatnot, but you see there's a long run-up into getting information, into actually making use of that information, be it geology or, shake maps and that sort of thing. So if anything you get out of this, know that there are things we can do by using what we see outside and each other as being able to mitigate problems that can arise from shaking by itself doesn't kill people. It's falling infrastructure, broken gas lines and that sort of thing. So this next little talk is just a few slides. And I want to say that the Bureau of Reclamation and this NEHRP, this National Earthquake Hazards Reduction Program, and the Arizona Geological Survey funded my work with several other people to go out to this fault that's up by the Hoover Dam and study it. And so I'm showing you this because It's still within your county, but also may affect the Colorado River corridor. And also, because I was talking about how we can improve our understanding of the Needles Fault, this is one of those examples of what we can get started with for Needles Fault. And then I think Mike has a few slides about failure scenarios when I'm finished with these quick slides. So you're like, what is that? Okay, so in this upper left, you see Arizona, and there's a small little almost square up by the mitten along the Colorado River. And that image that is the bigger one is in that general area. And so in the background are aerial photos, and then on that grayish strip is something that we created by flying a drone and taking 10,000 photos and crawling around on the ground and putting ground control points and GPS points. And when we stuff all this into a program, we're able to get a surface model. And I wish I could get this pointer to work, because there's something really cool in here. I wonder if I'd touch it here. I might advance the slide, sorry. If I do that. Aha. Okay, do you see this kind of, so this back here is just, these are two of those elevation models. So there's some kind of rough kind of mismatching of the photos, but what I want you to look at is this kind of odd linear looking thing here. This is actually what we call the Mead Slope Fault. And so it's right on the shore north of the Hoover Dam area. And it looks short. It only looks on the ground 5 kilometers. And why is that? Because the lake reservoir is there now. And it could be covering up the two ends, which makes sense. Because when we go out in the field and we stomp around on the ground, we see there's a vertical and lateral offset of up to 80 meters. So there have been a lot of earthquakes on this fault for a long time, so it's likely longer than 5 kilometers. Okay, let's see if I can. And so after all that field work and getting boat rides and boat rides and boat rides over there, this is what you end up with, this map here. And it's just color-coded based on rock type and landform type, which tells us about age. And all those black little lines across it are faults. And the most active fault is this strand here, with that green. That's what we focused on. And it has other small faults within the mapping area that may also rupture, but no one knows for sure how old those are. So if we stand outside, and no, I'm not flying, this is a drone image, looking towards Boulder City to the south here, here's that red line I drew for you in the other picture. You can see even just from the photo that there's something wrong with this landscape. And so what is this stuff out here? That's the high lake levels, right? And unfortunately in this place, where we want to know about earthquake history, that water level rising and lowering, it leaves sediment. It looks small from here, but when you go out there, if you can see in the photo, there's actually little like terraces of sediment from each lake level, up and down. All pieces of shell, flip-flops, anchors, beer cans, you name it. It's all in this sediment here. And why I'm telling you this is because it rubs out all the geology that would have told us about earthquakes not too long ago. And it's a real bummer. But instead of using Google Earth, and if you go in person and stomp around on the ground, you might find something cool. And we actually did. Right where this arrow is, right here, is a place where this side canyon here came out, and it used to be a little bit higher, and it dumped some sediment a long time ago. And we stumbled across this exposure. This might look a little weird to you, but those are little fault lines that actually rupture semi-young material. We date those materials with different methods, one called OSL, and we found that there were earthquakes that ruptured the ground and moved this fault about 20,000 years ago, another one 23,000, and another one 60,000, and many more that we weren't able to to discern out of this small exposure. So this is the kind of treatment I was talking about, needles. If we could, we would have better imagery and we'd focus our energies on actually digging a trench. This is what geologists do. They actually go have trenches dug and get in the trenches, and they look for offset layers, and they look for material to date, and from that we come up with an earthquake history. And we also look for evidence of the size. So these are all things that we can do as time marches on and funding appears. So won't bore you with too many of the details, but this is a graph showing peak ground acceleration, like what I showed you. We were talking about how the ground can accelerate away from you during an earthquake with respect to distance. So this is the peak ground acceleration in seconds negative square, so there would be a decimal right here. So if we look at this and we go 1 kilometer, 10 kilometers, 100 kilometers away from the source of where the earthquake occurred, then we can get an estimate of how much the ground's going to move if it's rock or sediment, based on magnitude 5, 6, 7, or 8. And this also means not just mapped on the surface, but an earthquake doesn't usually occur at 0 kilometers depth. It usually occurs for normal faults about 5. So if we look at this map of Hoover, right there, and then the meat slope fault, which is this here kind of crude red line, if the earthquake occurs right, say, in the center of that exposure at depth of 5 kilometers, it's about 5 kilometers from this end to there. So we're looking at anywhere from 10 to 12, 13 plus kilometers from Hoover to the fault, to the actual earthquake hypocenter. So, when you look back at that image, you're like, well, that puts us, let's say we're 10, maybe even a little more. We're going to experience half of 0.1, so 0.05, up to more than 0.1 G of acceleration of the ground. And so I don't want to go into too many details because I'm not an engineer, but I will say that a lot of things go into estimating damage on a big dam. I mean, that dam is massively thick. I would expect, if somebody just asked me, that maybe there'd be slight damage from a large earthquake on that structure, but I don't know. If you look at, does anybody remember that earthquake they had in New Zealand where there was a lot of damage, and they were very surprised in 2011 because it was only a magnitude 6.0? What gives? They've had much bigger before. Why all the damage? The problem lied in that it was a very shallow earthquake on the faults, and it moved the ground at 1.0% of G. That's very fast. Has anybody heard of the Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964? 9.2. Big. That would be something you would definitely write home about. The peak ground acceleration was still high, but 0.18. The difference. Depth, site conditions, speed of rupture. How quick was the release? Was it slightly slower or faster? There's a lot of things we don't know, and a lot of it is related to site conditions. So that's hopefully some smart engineers are looking into that for us, and we are prepared. The other thing I wanted to say about Meade is that I told you it was short. There's also a fault on the Nevada side that's called the Black Hills Fault, and that's on the west side of Boulder City there, and people have speculated in the past there could be a link between the two, but remember during dam construction that whole beach area was reworked, and so there's no way to look at the geology there per se and say they are linked for sure, but it is a possibility. That would make it longer, and that would mean what about the size? Bigger. Okay, so you guys might have questions about these slides that I can answer. You're like, I'm not in school. She's showing me these graphs, huh? But this is how this stuff's done. It's just, we do the best. When they made Hoover Dam, I don't think they looked at things like spectral amplitudes and displacement and duration of shaking. They didn't have enough information back then. But they did look at peak ground acceleration. And so I think that dam was at least built to withstand 0.1 G. So there's some food for thought for you right there. No questions? You can ask me after or email me. I can give my contact information out. But I think Mike has some slides. This is a view to the north, by the way, and you can't see the fault because it has all those lake level sediments on there.
Okay, we can go to the next presentation. If we could go to the next presentation, please. We're using the clicker. Slid it. Okay. So I'm going to go through a few slides now that kind of discuss or show the river system, the dams, and some of the possible effects that an earthquake nearby may have on the communities. So in starting that, in Mojave County, along the river where the stuff is located, there's several jurisdictions and we all work together. It's local, state, tribal, and federal agencies. And we sit back and we review risks. We call that a mitigation plan, where we're looking at how those types of problems can impact communities. We then train staff, we equip staff with equipment, maybe Homeland Security grant funding and different sources. We sit down and exercise those members of the community through disaster drills, if it's hazmat releases or flooding. And then we prepare for response, developing pre-plans, documents that help guide us that when we do have an event, that we're managing the event accordingly. So as something comes together, if it's a threat or a response, the cities may respond initially in their jurisdictions, and if they become overwhelmed or their resources become taxed, they'll reach out through mutual aid with surrounding jurisdictions. For example, in Mojave Valley, it's not uncommon for them to reach out across the Colorado River into San Bernardino County and ask for a fire truck or ambulances at times. So as that incident grows, they may choose to reach out to the county level where emergency management, we step in, we look at what we could do from the county perspective to provide assistance to the cities, as well as the unincorporated communities in Mojave County and the tribal community. So if that develops into something that's beyond the local level with resources, we'll reach out to the State of Arizona Division of Emergency Management, and they start bringing in state resources. So you can see there's this large network of agencies and groups, private as well, that work together to be prepared and respond to disasters. So as we go through this presentation, I just wanted to kind of give you that look of how we respond and plan for these events. So as Jerry just spent the last half hour or so, this is just an image that shows the upper half of Mojave County through mostly the Grand Canyon of our larger faults. I believe information that I've seen in past that Mojave County has one of the longest and largest faults in Arizona, which pretty much could end or begin at Peach Springs, and it runs all the way up through the Grand Canyon. Is it Hurricane Nevada that it touches? So we have some very large fault lines, as you can see in this representation. And as we talk about the Meade Slope or the Needle Slope this morning, you can see on the edge, western edge of the county here, that those faults are much smaller, or at least the Needles fault was much smaller. So in relation to dams on the river, this is information that's available on the internet, but Hoover Dam was construction started in 1930, and it took about 6 years to complete that project. And again, we have to think about in 1930, what kind of technology did we have to look at earthquake risk? And we've come a long way in 90-some years in technology. So, were those faults, were they even aware of a lot of these faults, or how those faults might impact a structure like we would look at something today? So I guess where I'm going is that between the dam and the new bridge, totally different environments on engineering capabilities to look at how those things could be impacted by a local seismic event. So Hoover Dam is really close to 90 years old as it stands today. It's concrete. It holds back Lake Mead, which in a time when we're not dealing with drought, up to 26 million acre feet of water. So today we're at, was it maybe 30% capacity? So totally different environment as far as the water storage capability at the moment. So this again is just another image of what Jerry showed, where in relation of Hoover Dam to the fault line at Mead Slope. And you can see the bridge just underneath the arrow there. So there's been some other studies. A lot of this information is available on the internet. And Missouri, there's a group there that did a presentation a few years back on the river system. And this is just one slide that we borrowed from that presentation. And it shows a mapping or an image here of about 26 different fault lines that are right at the dam. And most of those structures, are probably small in nature, but there's over some other 500 in the region around the tri-state area there, Vegas, and coming into the Arizona side of the river. As we go down through the river system towards Bullhead City, we come into Lake Mojave, and we have Davis Dam. So at Davis, construction started in 1942, finished in 1950. The structure there is about 71 years old, and it's an earthen dam. And we know that during large earthquake impacts, that earthen dams have a different impact than a concrete dam. So a little more concern as far as, in relation to how close earthquakes are and how those events can impact the facilities there. Davis Dam, where the water level is there at the floodgates, it's about 140 foot tall from the lower portion of the Colorado River, and it also holds about 1.5 million acre feet. Most of the time, Lake Mojave doesn't drop much. It's a reservoir that's kept full, and where Lake Mead, we're seeing those impacts much lower at the present. So going back around 1983, there was a flooding event along the Colorado River where all the facilities, all the lakes, everything was full. And the Bureau of Reclamation, which manages flood control along the river, kind of got into a situation where where the snowmelt in Colorado happened fairly quickly, and it overwhelmed that storage system. And the BOR had to release water from the lakes in order to manage the system safely. That release flooded hundreds of miles of shoreline, all the way from basically starting at Laughlin, Nevada, all the way through Yuma, causing a lot of property damage and infrastructure damage, and it was just a controlled release. So with a lot of lessons learned from that event, and as communities and agencies learned from the 1983 event, construction standards, floodplain, permitting in areas that are prone to flooding, a lot of those things would now help mitigate or protect from flooding of those types of events in the future. what we're showing here is a list of communities that are located in what we call the Colorado River floodway. And after that 83 flood, the feds had created that floodway to represent under a controlled flood what that might look like so that communities could plan around that in the future. So you can see Bullhead, Laughlin, Fort Mojave Mesa, the Mojave Valley, Fort Mojave Indian Tribe, Needles, Golden Shores, Topak, Desert Hills, Havasu Landing, and Lake Havasu. That's just the communities in Mojave County. So going back to the risk at the top of the bottle here, 6.7 event from Meade Slope. There was some studies done that would indicate that an event of that size could create structure impacts to Hoover. And if an uncontrolled release of water was to occur from an event like that, it's likely that that water would have devastating or catastrophic events downstream to Lake Mojave, as well as communities all the way through the river system. So to plan for worst case scenarios, the Bureau of Reclamation years back, going back probably well before 20 years, I've been doing this, different things with them since 1984, I believe it was. It's been a long time. They are required to have a response document, which basically addresses what happens and how we work together during an event. So that event could be something very small, internal, or it could be something that's catastrophic. So through action plans, the document helps us address how the agency that's having the problem or a concern or threat where it's occurring, how we interact with each other, and how information such as emergency communications, the incident command on how that incident is going to be managed, if it's local or if it's from a location in Salt Lake City, as well as public information on how we alert the public and make decisions for such as evacuations in an area that might be threatened by a flood. In a document like this, we have what we call inundation mapping, and this is an example of one. This isn't the Colorado River, it's a document or an image I got from FEMA, but it shows exactly what flooding in a document for the Colorado River would look like. And it gives first responders an opportunity to look at where in a worst case scenario that flood might reach, and what's in that community that's in the floodway, if it's hazardous materials, schools, hospitals, transportation, or other infrastructure. So we have a plan that goes through the entire Colorado River system that shows us those risk areas, and then it allows those communities to prepare and plan for response in the event that something like this was to actually occur. Another very important document or piece of the planning is a table like this. So in worst case, we're able to look at the volume, and we go through the river system and determine through, they have mile markers on the Colorado River, and we can kind of get an idea how long the wave arrival for the flood might impact an area. And these are just very stretched estimates because on each event could be different. A lot of different factors along the river could slow or increase those times a little bit. So here in one of the studies that we looked at from the earthquake event, it could take anywhere from 3 to 4 hours for flooding to reach Bullhead City, or a total of 8 hours to 9 for an area like Needles, or the last one here was 14 to 15 hours to Lake Havasu City. So we look at, in the response side, what do we need to do in that time frame to get people to safe areas, and how we communicate that to the public, if it's through social media or going door to door. So effects on the infrastructure. So here, this is an image here at Needles at Topak, and you don't see the fault line here, but it would be on the right side of the image going back into Arizona. This is looking upriver into the Havasu Wildlife Refuge. But in just this one image, there's probably $1 billion worth of infrastructure that crosses that river between the Santa Fe or the Burlington Northern Santa Fe Rail, Interstate 40. There's another 3 pipeline bridges that all cross, fiber optic cables. All this stuff can be threatened with an earthquake of a large magnitude. And not just within this one spot, but how this entire river system would be impacted all the way through Yuma into Mexico. So it's not just our little piece at Mojave, but as you go down through Parker, Blythe, and in the Yuma County itself. So this event's not just a local event, it's a tri-state, southwestern United States event that would impact millions of people, not just a few thousand here in Mojave. So in saying that, some of the action items that we're going to walk forward with after today, we're currently, for example, working with the federal government, the 3 states, and several smaller communities here on the river on completing a communications plan, which is going to allow our 911 centers, along with state and federal officials, to communicate instantaneously important information related to the event. That plan's almost completed. Regional response plans. So over the years, communities like Lake Havasu, Mojave Valley, Bullhead have all planned for events like this. And the county's been working with those jurisdictions in developing one tri-state plan that would address Laughlin, Needles, as well as the Arizona side, so that that response could be better coordinated and the resources utilized in a better manner. We're looking at the possibility of looking at new fault studies, as Jerry had mentioned earlier, being able to get additional data so that we can look at or have a better picture of what some of that risk might look like, as well as maybe looking at grant dollars or private donations that might buy additional seismic monitoring capabilities for the region. We're going to be reaching out to the communities along the fault line area, if it's Golden Shores, Mojave Valley, and the Fort Mojave Tribe, and share earthquake awareness. And that we're working with our local utility companies to look at additional funding opportunities so that as we walk forward in planning and pre-planning, that some of those corporate dollars might be available to help with the lack of grant funding that may not be out there for us to take advantage of. So with that, are there any questions on the slides I've just shared? Sure. In this presentation, I didn't go below Lake Havasu, but Parker Dam is impacted, nothing like Davis or Hoover would. But yeah, the planning does go through Yuma all the way through to the Mexican border.
That seems like that would get you.
Yeah, and I don't think it's so much the decisions on how to get the funding. I think it's just the low dollars of funding that's out there. It's if it's response equipment, that's one thing, but if it's doing funding for studies on earthquakes, that funding is very small, and there's a lot of folks out there looking for that. So I think the justification's well there. It's just the smaller amount of dollars that are available for folks out there to do those types of studies. Jerry.
You were talking about the tri-state responder comms.
Yes.
Does that include Europe?
So what occurs in an event. So if there was a problem or something occurring at one of the dams, and they felt that the downstream community needed to be aware of the developing situation, there's a procedure how they push that information out to the first responder community. And we've known for years that process can be cumbersome because there's a lot of agencies between Hoover Dam and Yuma. So in an effort to better coordinate that in today's world, this last year we sat down and created a tri-state working group to identify all the 911 centers and emergency management level agencies, and we came together to look at how we could build a better response plan for that, utilizing two-way radio communications or satellite or a lot of different platforms that are out there, so that if we were impacted by an event such as an earthquake like this, would the internet be available? Would landline be available? And when we deal with responder agencies, like for example, San Bernardino County, their dispatch center isn't in Needles. And we're reaching far into Southern California just to be able to communicate with their decision makers. Where at Boulder, their dispatch center's there in Vegas, just a few miles away. So we have to look at how we are able to communicate between Vegas and Kingman and San Bernardino County, and then the agencies in between. So that comms plan will be a really nice document to be able to keep us all focused on when we need to communicate information and how well that takes place in a timely manner. Yes. We call it DEMA. Yes. Yes, we're all part of that partnership. As I said a little earlier, it's not just a Mojave County problem, but it's a tri-state threat. And DEMA is a big part of our activities. They're kind of our parent agency that help provide funding for emergency management. And they are a big part of our planning and training efforts across the region. So, any other questions? Any online questions? Any closing comments? So.
No, they were talking about some California, Oregon, Washington, earthquake warning. You are in an area and there's an earthquake, get an alert on your phone. You can't be too close to the event. Earthquake, if you're standing on the fault and it happens, and earthquake waves haven't even gotten to the computer yet. Tell the early earthquake cell towers. That's they're working on radios and cell modems at a lot of redundant. That nowhere near. And we may not need it, right? We're not. What we need here is dam does have some issues. How are they going to communicate? Earthquake, we do setting up a clearinghouse. Say, like the Duncan earthquake, kept getting people calling us, and there was give them information on the like. We're working on that for that. This bigger operation. No, it is on. All right. Was I loud enough?
So in addition to that question, so we have first responder communications that take place between the first responder agencies and government, and that's closed. It's usually operational and tactical communications that are dealing with the event, the response to the event. But then we have, as a threat to the community develops, we're going to reach out, our public information officer at the county or city, at federal level, we'll be putting together press releases so that the public's informed of what's occurring. We may not have all the facts right up front, what that might look like, but there would be some form of information sent out to the public to say that we have an event that's happening, and as we find out more information, more details, then we would update those press releases accordingly. You know, we see that every summer during wildland fires. You'll see a forestry press briefing at noon and in early evening, and they'll give details of what's been occurring and accomplished through the mission. So here in Mojave, we have a product called Code Red, where we're able to basically reverse 911 to the community if they've got a landline, or if their cell phone's registered with our system. And that might be a means that if we were concerned about an environment where there might be flooding in a residential area and we wanted folks to be prepared for that, we would use a product like that to do that, as well as door-to-door or other social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter. So yes, there's a lot of options for us available today to reach the public. We have this thing called the EAS system. We used to remember years ago. Actually, you hear it every time there's a thunderstorm threat, flash flooding. It cuts into the radio. We maintain a system like that that's still usable, and again, that would be another way that we would reach the public. Oh, iPause. Yes, iPause is not, it's a new product, but it's really new for Mojave. As part of our Code Red and some of the other social media products that we have out, iPause is another piece of FEMA which allows us through our dispatch center to send messages to cell phones in a text version, and we can go on a mapping document and circle a neighborhood if there was a law enforcement concern, and then by circling that neighborhood, all the cell phones in that circle would receive that message. So there's a lot of neat things that technology today is allowing us to be able to share information quicker and more precise. There's no need to evacuate the entire county if we have a problem that's only a couple of blocks wide. So,
Well, do you guys remember during COVID, Utah had this earthquake? It was a magnitude 5.3. It wasn't very big, but it was shallow, and they had a lot of damage. What they dealt with mostly was misinformation. People on Twitter and Facebook and all the other social platforms and saying, oh, this is the precursor to the 9.2 that's coming, and, just scaring. And so all of their emergency departments were inundated with phone calls and people and just wanting. And people want information now. They're used to Twitter and Instagram or Facebook. And so that clearinghouse that I was talking about that we're trying to create, is going to have some social media aspect to it. It's really the way to communicate with people. And with respect to the texts that come through, my phone, if it doesn't know the number, will put it in the unknowns and I won't see it. So I don't know if the system can usurp that feature on your phone, where, I don't know, does anybody else have that besides me? I mean, I'll look later and I'm like, I have 10 text messages from people that I didn't have as a contact, and it's in the spam. So there's the constant changing of how we're going to get this information out to people. And this Twitter won't go away. So I think that one is too bad. But that one might be the one to use in addition to Facebook, Instagram. But that was, if you look at their emergency response that they had in Utah, it was pandemonium. And they are working around the clock right now, all their emergency managers and different folks that run the seismic network and that, to try to get past this problem of misinformation and how to get the right information out to people, and also be ready for regular phone calls. They had so many that they just couldn't keep on top of for the different departments, like even the geology department. So I don't know if that's helpful, but when they said that about, it was just a 5.2, but they had church damage, and they had quite a bit of structural facades come off, and people were scared. Plus we were all scared because we didn't know what COVID was, but that made it worse, amplifying the fear and all the misinformation. And so that's something to keep in mind. It is an uphill battle with other people getting on and saying things that aren't true and pretending to be authority when they're not. It's real, and it's something that has to be in that plan for pre-mitigation. Sorry.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Any questions online? Well, that will conclude our conversation and presentation on the earthquake risk along the Colorado River. It's available on YouTube. And if you have any questions, would like to speak with us directly, you can reach Mojave County Emergency Management, and we'd be glad to have a conversation with you. Thank you again. Have a good day.